Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 304, a landmark episode because I have better lighting and better sound. Hopefully, this is going to rub off on the content. What I'm going to talk about today is this record, Sonny Rollins and the Contemporary Leaders, released unsurprisingly on Contemporary Records. My copy is a 1960 UK first pressing. It's a stereo pressing. Contemporary, of course, were amongst the very first to do stereo, and it's released on Contemporary's UK licensee, Vogue Records. This, of course, is the very last studio recording that Rollins makes before his famous 3-year hiatus from recording and playing between 1959 and 1962. It's a fascinating record because it pairs Rollins, one of the quintessential East Coast hard bop icons, with a whole slew of top-rank LA cool school players. And maybe unsurprisingly, it doesn't fit neatly into either the hard bop or the cool school definitions. It's also interesting because it's recorded at a time in late 1958 when Rollins is increasingly conscious of the contributions particularly to be made by John Coltrane, but also increasingly the rumblings from people like Ornette Coleman. It has great variety, great experimentation. It shows Rollins at the peak of his early powers, but great record though it is, on its release, Rollins became convinced that he needed some quality time away with just his horn as company to rethink his whole approach. Sonny Rollins' career is a very stop-start one, with these famous absences self-imposed from performing and recording. In the last video I did about Sonny Rollins regarding his record Saxophone Colossus, I talked about the break that he'd taken in 1955. Prior to that, he had risen to the very top of the jazz world. This is most notable in the recordings he did with Miles Davis in 1954, which you can find on records like Dig and Bag's Groove. But Rollins at the time was also addicted to heroin, and it was starting to show up in his playing and starting to show up in his relationships with other people and starting to show up in the fact that he was going to jail now and then. So in 1955, in order to kick the habit, he goes to the famous farm in Lexington, Kentucky, where he gets clean, also gets in touch with his more spiritual side. Soon after that, he passes up the chance to join Miles Davis's first great quintet, electing instead to take a gap year in Chicago rather than plunge himself into the temptations of the New York club scene. And towards the end of his time in Chicago, he ends up joining a really great group, the Clifford Brown-Max Roach Quintet. Brown in particular had a massive impact on Rollins. Rollins felt that the trumpeter was at least his musical equal, if not his musical superior, which is not an accolade which Sonny has bestowed on many. Importantly, Brown was also clean, disrupting the association that Rollins had made, like many other young players in the age of Charlie Parker, between heroin use and musical genius. With the Brown Roach Quintet, Rollins returns to New York at the end of 1955, and they receive rave reviews, but this all comes to a shuddering halt in the spring of 1956 when Brown is killed in June in a car crash. This is a devastating event, not just for the quintet, but obviously for the music scene in New York as a whole. One of the consequences was to, I guess, in an involuntary way, force Rollins out into the open at a really key point in his development. Because at this point he was clean, he'd been learning from the very best players around, and he now had the confidence and ambition to reach for the top. And much like Miles in 1954 and Coltrane in 1957, when they had respectively kicked their own heroin habits, Rollins is absolutely bursting with musical ideas. And so following that first sabbatical, in the period between December 1955 and October 1958, less than 3 years, Rollins is a leader on no fewer than 16 records. He records 25 of his own original compositions in that period, plus scores of standards. This is an average of something like 6 LPs a year. This period contains the first really sustained flourishing of Rollins' talent, and in particular, the 6 records he releases on Prestige in 1956 are amazing. They include, of course, his record Tenor Madness with a guest appearance from John Coltrane, and his great record Saxophone Colossus, which of course has that wonderful composition St. Thomas. After this, Rollins then leaves Prestige and he begins to record for a variety of labels, and with his growing confidence, he begins to tinker with the expected cliches of jazz. In particular, he begins to record in a trio setting with just bass and drums alongside. Now, Jerry Mulligan earlier in the decade had dispensed with a piano as part of his quartet, but he was able to rely on Chet Baker for harmonies, melodic color, and solo time. And by 1957, Rollins' trio recordings were as stripped down as it ever existed in the jazz world, and the record which really grabs people's attention is Way Out West. Up to that point, Rollins had only ever recorded in New York, but Way Out West was made on his very first trip out to California in March 1957 as a sideman for Max Roach. At that point, Rollins was out of contract. He'd left Prestige and he was recording on a one-off basis with Blue Note and with Riverside. So when they were playing LA, Les Koenig, the head of Contemporary Records, ever the opportunist, gets chatting to Rollins at the club and convinces him to make a record for Contemporary. Way Out West is a trio record, and on that record, Rollins uses 2 musicians that he'd never met, let alone played with before. They include the cool jazz drummer Shelly Manne and Ray Brown, who was Oscar Peterson's longtime bassist, who at the time was starting to develop a very healthy side hustle as a session player. Both the rehearsals and the recording of the record took place in the wee hours over several consecutive nights, and the results were spectacular, as was the cover, and Way Out West really establishes a very distinct sound for Rollins at that particular time in jazz history. A year and a half later, in October 1958, Rollins comes out to California again, this time leading his own groups, which were often cobbled together from local players that he knew or promoters would know. He plays Monterey Jazz, and then he's got a whole series of dates in LA and San Francisco. In San Francisco, he plays for 2 weeks at the Jazz Workshop with a quartet featuring Elmo Hope on piano, Lenny McBrown on drums, and the great young bassist Scott LaFaro. And at those gigs, he meets another bass player, Leroy Vinegar, who had just started recording as a leader in his own right for contemporary, and the two of them really hit it off. They agree to make a record together, and the choice of label is pretty obvious. Leroy is already part of Koenig's stable at Contemporary, and Rollins had great memories of the first record he'd made for Contemporary, so he calls up Koenig. Unsurprisingly, given the success of the previous record, Koenig needs very little persuading, so a few days later, Rollins goes into Contemporary's cramped little studio in LA to make this record. This record is made over 3 days, October 20th, 21st, and 22nd, 1958. The producer is Les Koenig, and the engineer is the great Roy Dunan. Of course, they already had the bass player lined up for the gig in Leroy Vinegar, so Rollins turns to Koenig for suggestions to fill out the rest of the group. The names that Koenig came up with had all previously recorded as leaders for Contemporary. Shelly Manne, who of course played on that earlier Rollins date for the label, is back on drums, and the excellent Hampton Hawes is drafted in on piano. Koenig then threw Rollins a bit of a curveball, suggesting that they add a guitarist, Barney Kessel, to the date. Rollins had never recorded with a guitarist, so he was keen to experiment, and finally they added the British multi-instrumentalist Victor Feldman on vibes on one track. So all in all, quite an impressive group on this record, and if you know even a little bit about West Coast jazz, you'll recognize that this is basically an all-star lineup. And they settled in to rehearse and record 8 numbers, somewhat unusually for Rollins, no originals, all standards, probably a feature of the fact that this was basically an impromptu session. Side 1 starts with I've Told Every Little Star, which has pretty much everything you would ever want from a West Coast session packed with this particular talent, driven by a brilliant, effortless walking bass line by Leroy Vinegar, which continues right through Hampton Hawes' excellent solo. Next is Rockabye Your Baby with a Dixie melody, which shows Rollins at his lighthearted best. He may not have had as much emotional range in playing as Coltrane did, but he probably did have more range in the happier end of the spectrum. Next is a really interesting version of How High the Moon, which is a trio format with just bass and guitar. It has a jam-like feel, and it takes a while to get going. This is a track which bass nuts are going to love because it's in fact Vinegar's bass that both Kessel and Rollins play off. And about a third of the way into the track, they suddenly seem to catch a second wind, and from then on, it's amazing. The final track on side 1U is the one which Feldman plays the vibes on. It's basically a vehicle for both Rollins and Feldman, who are both ripping off incredible runs. Side 2 starts with I Found a New Baby, which is a hard-swinging blues that's just a delight. It's got all kinds of great Rollins technique and lots of the fun and lighthearted side of his playing again. Next is Alone Together, which features a fantastic performance by Barney Kessel, maybe his best ever solo. Leroy Vinegar is excellent on this as well. And the next track, In the Chapel in the Moonlight, also features Kessel. This is a really lovely, sentimental, Father of the Bride, Dancing with the Bride kind of a ballad. But the biggest surprise, given the lineup on this record, is reserved for the very last track, The Song Is You. Cool jazz, this is not. What this is Rollins rising subconsciously or consciously to the challenge laid down by Coltrane on Giant Steps. It's also really interesting listening for anybody who tends to write off Shelly Manne as a club owner who could keep decent time. This record is beautifully recorded and natural sounding, and it shows that not only was Rudy Van Gelder not the only good jazz engineer in the 1950s, he might not actually have been the best jazz engineer in the 1950s. Despite this being an effort from 6 players who were all leading their own dates at the time, this is very much a Sonny Rollins record. It's rare that more than 1 or 2 of the other players takes a solo. And being made on the cusp of his very next sabbatical, it's an interesting time capsule into Rollins' musical state and interests. But whatever his approach, his playing is magnificent. For a guy who famously took the state of his own playing very seriously, he doesn't take himself too seriously when he plays, and that pays off, especially in the solos. This record is not often mentioned amongst Rollins' best efforts. I'm not sure why that is. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.